Welcome to the Team EF Coaching Cycling Performance Podcast, where we take information from the highest level of sport and make it accessible to all cyclists. I'm your host, Zack Morris, and on this episode, we have Colby Pearce and Nicki Sørensen joining us to share some thoughts and strategies on how you can start mastering your power meter and maximize its efficiency as a training tool, while avoiding the common and toxic trait of letting the power meter dominate your rides. Now, many of you may know, but Coach Colby and his longtime friend, who is now the CEO of EF Pro Cycling, Jonathan Vaughters, were actually the first two riders in America to ever get power meters on their bikes. So to start this conversation, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Colby to share the story of how he found out about the power meter and why he got one, and what the tool's immediate impact on his training were.
Thanks, Zach. I have to correct you. I don't think JV and I were quite the first and second riders ever. I think we were behind Greg LeMond. So, but I don't know if you count Greg LeMond as being in the US. So debatable. But basically, JV called me up one day and said, dude, we're buying a power meter. And I was like, what's a power meter? And he's like, it's this crazy invention. This German guy, Ulrich Schoberer, made this thing called a power meter, and it measures your output in watts. And we're going to buy one, I'm going to buy one, and you're going to buy one, and we're going to put them on our bikes, and it's going to be the next best thing. So this was in 1994, and probably about 50% of the riders I was training and racing with had heart rate monitors, and just about everybody had a basic cyclocomputer, which really was, basic. It measured your time on the bike and your speed and your distance. And occasionally, some of them had cadence sensors. That was all the data we had. So we really didn't go out on a ride and have any idea how much output we were putting out. That's what a power meter measures, is output. We had an idea of how long we rode, but that was of course subject to weather, wind, and terrain. And we could match our time over a specific climb to see if we were going faster or slower. But again, that was always subject to weather. So it was very hard to figure out if you were going faster, if your training was effective. And so Jonathan explained to me that a power meter, by measuring our objective output, will be able to give us some idea if we were actually improving from the training we were doing on the bike. And this was, at the time, people weren't really thinking this way. Of course, there were exercise labs and you could go in and do exercise tests, but not many people had access to those. And it was sort of a rare, elusive thing for people to go into an exercise lab and use a VO2 card or use an indoor bike that may have had power at that time. But so we were the first riders to explore that, and it definitely impacted my training in massive amounts. I would say the first thing that it really taught me was simply how to pace a long effort. So what I learned is that your perceived exertion and your actual output don't necessarily correlate. For example, if I started one of my local climbs that was about 30 minutes long, and I rode at what I thought was a constant pace based off my perceived exertion or just how hard I thought I was going on the bike, my power, as it turns out, would be way, way too high at the beginning, and then it would slowly nosedive and taper off as I continued up the climb. So what a power meter taught me is that perceived exertion isn't an accurate reflection of output, of steady output, especially at the beginning of a long effort. So it taught me how to pace my effort more effectively. And this became a really powerful tool for me to pace myself on long climbs, or more relevantly for me at the time trials. I did a lot of long time trials at that time in my career. So it really taught me how to keep my output even and not do too much at the beginning and explode into smithereens and then hang on for dear life or die in a ball of flames.
So Nicki, you've also been in the game for a long time, turning pro back in 1999. When were you first introduced to the power meter, and how did it affect your rides in the beginning?
Yeah, that was that same year that I got introduced to the power meter. I wrote the first season for a Danish, what corresponds today to a pro Conti team. And then at the end of this year, I got the opportunity to be coached by Bjarne Riis, who, the former Tour de France winner that had stopped his career a few years earlier and wanted to go into coaching. This was just before he started the CSC team, Saxo Bank team back in the day, or entered that. So I got the chance to be coached by Bjarne Riis at the end of '99, and he had been using just like Colby power meters from the early days. He was one of the first ones in Europe to use the power meters. So I entered that very special way of training. Bjarne was a super good coach, and it was a special thing, already from the first test. Bjarne had bought a special SRM test machine. I don't know if you saw that back in the day from SRM, Colby, but a big monster. So he was all in on all of these things there, and it was a special thing. Like Colby was into. It was very specific. It was very precise in the training, and I really enjoyed getting a lot of the input from Bjarne's experience with power meters over the years. And one of the special things I found interesting was that he said during the intervals, it's not, I don't want you to go for the average power in the intervals. I want you to go for the power when you have the good road ahead. So traffic lights and stuff like that, don't try and hit up. If you lose power in traffic lights, don't try and get the average power up again after that. So it's all about when you have the good road. So that meant intervals like, for example, long intervals in rolling hills, which I used. I was in Denmark back in that time, meant that I had to go relatively slow on these long intervals on the climbs, and then on the long descents, I had to go very fast in order to have the same power. So that the whole feeling of both speed or on these long climbs and on these long descents and this easy going up the climbs was a very special feeling. It was very precise, and at the same time very, very cool to really feel feel the output, feel that precise output.
Interesting. I think Bjarne was a little bit ahead of his time in some of that instruction that he was giving you. Very innovative. Thanks for sharing, both of you. So, like all tools in life, we constantly refine the way we use them and the things we can build with them. For me, the power meter is no different. My personal relationship has changed with the tool over the 16 years that I've been training with one. And I have to say that I have gone full circle with my perspective in my own training. From once praising the power meter as the holy grail and the only way to justify a productive training session, to now where I hardly ever look at power on my rides. And I'm primarily using heart rate and RPE and respiratory rate and speed on climbs as the point of metrics that I immediately check in on. I often look at power data after the fact with the notion of, that's cool. But this relationship with the tool wasn't something that took shape overnight. Instead, it is a result of many moments of learning, overcoming internal conflict, and ultimately wanting to find joy in riding while this extremely competitive mindset still exists in me. As a coach, I still love the power meter as a tool to teach people all of the lessons I've learned and what is happening on their rides, my clients' rides. But we'll get into how we use the tool in our coaching practice a little bit later on. But before we do that, I wanted to ask the both of you how your relationship has evolved over the years with the power meter as a tool in your arsenal.
Good question, Zach. I would say, touching on what you just mentioned there, Nicki, the idea that Bjarne coached you to first use the power meter when you have good roads, but secondly, there's sort of a paradox there because it sounds like he was asking you to really look after your average when you did have good roads on rolling terrain, meaning back off on the hills and then push over the top and then really learn to find the speed on the downhills. And I think there are two valuable lessons there that I have learned early on and still use. This is one of the things that's remained constant in my power meter usage. Is there are two components of power when we're thinking mathematically, right? Torque, which is how hard you're pushing on the pedals, and velocity, which is cadence, right? Or I should say force, which is torque, and speed, which is cadence. Those two multiplied times each other equal power. And so a lot of riders associate making more power with pushing harder on the pedals. And I would equate this historically and even today to some degree with what I call French training, right? So French riders, I'll beat up on France for a second. French riders tend to go out historically or classically and they ride, and on flat terrain, they chit chat. And then they get to a climb and they go really fast. And then on a descent, they just kind of coast down the descent. And then on the flats, they chit chat again. And that's basically the synopsis of their training methodology. And when they have a lot of climbs on their ride, the ride's really hard. And when they have not many climbs, it's an easier day. So it's very terrain dictated. And naturally, there is a natural tendency for a lot of riders to go faster up climbs. A lot of riders identify with climbs as the archetype of what cycling is about. And going uphill fast is sort of one of those, it's a timeless battle that we have on the bike, right? So there's that side of training. The other side is to learn to make speed on the bike or make more power by pedaling more quickly as opposed to pushing harder. It's easier for a rider to connect with the force aspect of power when they feel the resistance, we'll say, of the pedal by pushing down harder with increased torque on a steep climb, for example. And that's how a lot of riders identify with making power. So I learned that early in my use of the power meter, and it taught me that I can make power on the flats by pedaling more quickly or even on downhills. And this is a really powerful tool that we use in our coaching system all the time, but I've used as a rider and especially as a track rider, because when you got one gear, there's a point when the only way to go faster is to pedal faster. So I've used power to help instill that practice in my riding in all terrains and all scenarios, headwinds, tailwinds, side winds, etc. Another way my relationship with power has evolved is it taught me a lot about the energy expenditure on the bike, the number of kilojoules of work that we produce during our ride. And this measure of work is useful as a metric to understand how the training load will impact you physiologically. It's not everything, but it is an indicator. It's a good metric. And I still use kilojoules to some degree when I work with my riders and in my own power. But similar to you, Zach, I don't watch kilojoules or training stress score or even average power during an effort or a climb while I'm riding, for example, up a big hill with my friends. I'm more focused on my own internal perceived exertion because I found that power is the measure of output, but the true dictator of pacing is our own internal tachometer, right? If you're halfway up a 10K climb and someone accelerates, at that moment, it doesn't actually matter how many watts you're doing, I would argue. What is more important is the sensation you're having. If you're already at maximum, then the numbers are sort of irrelevant. On the other hand, if you have room to play with and you want to follow that rider, your objective is to stay with that rider or maybe drop them later on in the climb, then the choice is simple. You follow them. We're not looking at our power meters. I'm not looking at my power meter and estimating how many kgs of anaerobic work I've got left in my legs. I'm not trying to figure out where I am in my threshold by looking at one snapshot of a few seconds of power at that moment. Because my power in that instant over the length of maybe a 30-minute climb doesn't tell the whole picture. It's a little bit like looking at a single frame of a movie and trying to understand the entire plot from that frame. So if we look at a single frame of Star Wars and we see the Death Star exploding and X-Wing fighters flying away, you could maybe kind of get the plot. You could be like, well, maybe that's the bad guys dying and those are the good guys. I don't know. It will require quite a bit of interpretation. But if we see the scene where Chewbacca is playing space chess, we are super lost. We have no idea what's going on. And this is the problem with looking at power, a snapshot of power for 1 or 3 or 5 seconds and extrapolating it to a 30-minute context. It doesn't tell us that much about the movie. It doesn't tell us what we did the first 10 minutes of the climb. It doesn't tell us if we ate enough, if we drank enough, etc. So my own evolution of use as a power meter as a power meter user is that I would say I'm very similar to you, Zach. I use it reflectively to help paint the picture of what I'm feeling internally, what my internal sense of strain is.
Really interesting. That's a great analogy you just came up with there. Nicki, what about you? How has your relationship with the power meter changed?
I had the same a little bit as with you guys, that in the beginning I was using it a lot, and it was a great tool. I changed coach from Bjarne to a different coach already early in my career, And in that change, I got some very hard training sessions prescribed. And at the same time, I was starting to, during those trainings, feeling that I wanted to break records all the time in training. I was starting to, I did some really good numbers in some of the efforts. And then the following time I had to do the same type of workout, I found myself, I was not hitting the same numbers. So I kind of, even though I did probably fine in power-wise in those efforts, I started to be unimpressed with my own numbers. And I started to feel that almost the power meter was my adversary. It was kind of a little bit my enemy. It was beating me down a little bit. That combined with, we're talking about years into my work with power meters, that combined with the fact that often in races, because I was so focused on power meters, I was often sitting in a race during intense moments and thinking, I wonder how much power I'm pushing right now, because I couldn't look at the power, because you know how intense it is in races. A lot of stuff is going on and you don't want to sit and look at those numbers all the time. So I was thinking, I wonder how much power I'm using right now. How is my how is my pacing? And at that point, I was telling myself, this has gone a little bit too far with my work in power. In retrospect, I needed a guy to guide me in all of this process. But the bottom line is, I ended up not using a coach for a period of time, and I ended up in the middle of my career not using the power meter at all. It just got taken off. I took it off my bike. I had to use it in the race for several reasons, because and one of them was we were sponsored by SRM in back in the day in Team CSC. But I totally went the other way and did not look at power meters in training and in racing. I did not look at it in the race. And I had success with that. I got back to the roots, and we have to keep in mind that I had a lot of experience with power meters by that point, so I knew how to pace myself. But there was a funny little story of a training camp we did. I think it was around 2003 or 2004, or maybe 5. And we had a meeting, all of the riders, and Bjarne was talking, and for some reason he gave an example in to everybody regarding me, because I had success. I won a stage in the Vuelta the year before, and I started out fine in won a race in France. And he said, and look at how Nicki is doing, and he was saying, what is the reason for your success? And I was saying, I think it's, and I didn't say it in a way to be provocative or anything, but I said, I think it's because I've stopped using the power meter. And he did not want to hear that. he said it like that, actually. I said, I don't want to hear this. And then he shut me down. But the fact was that this was a way of finding my way of pacing myself again. So I went from using it a lot to not using it at all. And then later on in the career, I started using it again. And at that point, I really started again appreciating how to do precise training with power. So it kind of went a little bit full circle in my career.
That's a really great story. Thanks for sharing that one, Nicki. So one of the analogies that I love to use to help our athletes bridge the gap between understanding how to use the power meter as a productive tool instead of a screen that dominates their rides is as follows. When you go to the gym, you see weights with numbers on them. Those numbers represent different amounts of resistance. It comes natural to all of us that we would use a different amount of resistance to do a bicep curl than a full body squat, or different weights in the same exercise in a low versus high repetition set. In cycling, we want to get into the habit of understanding that we are constantly using different levels of resistance to develop various components of our cycling skill set. Whether it's explosive power repeatability or an increased threshold, there are always supporting elements of rider composition in every ability. I can speak for all of our staff here on this point at Team EF Coaching. We are committed to helping athletes develop well-rounded rider composition, whether they want to race or not. It's just a healthier way to build physiology. So guys, I want to turn the question to you. How are you using the power meter as a tool in your coaching practices today?
So I would say that that's a great story, Nicki. By the way, I just have to comment. I think I had a similar path. I used power early and then I left it for a while and then I came back to it full circle. So I just wanted to add that. Really, I try to use power. I think power is a tool, right? And there's an old saying, use the right tool for the job. So there are moments in training when we can use power meters prescriptively, meaning we give riders a range of power that we want them to target for a given effort. And this can be useful. It can have a lot of utility because it can drive a rider to push themselves on a day where they're struggling with intervals, for example. Also, for short anaerobic intervals or glycolytic work, a power meter can be quite instructive because it can help guide intensity in areas where riders have a little more difficulty discerning whether they're making too much power. So for example, if you give someone a set of 45-second intervals, this is sort of an odd duration for someone to self-pace frequently. And so they might start off for the first 15 seconds way too hot and then just explode, right, in the last 15 seconds. And that in itself can be a useful exercise to learn the limits of your physiological ability. However, if we want to have efforts that are a little more sustainable, if we're giving them 8 or 10 or 12 of those efforts scattered throughout a road ride, for example, then using power to help them stay within a particular range can be really helpful and prescriptive. It can also help with pacing on long efforts, and it can teach us things. The downside of writing training prescriptively is that sometimes you can limit a rider on a day where they can actually do quite a bit more. This is even a bigger hazard on race day. But then also, as you mentioned, Nicki, there are times when, for example, you feel that, 3 weeks ago you did a 5-minute effort at X power, and today you go out and you're struggling like crazy and going nuts, and you make 3% less or 20 watts less or whatever, and you feel like you're not doing your work. And so when I work with my athletes, I really offer to them that, especially on those types of workouts, those types of days where we're working on, we'll say VO2 level efforts or glycolytic efforts, those days I coach them to have the perspective that we're really this is laying bricks in the foundation of a home. And you know what? Bricks are nothing special. Like every brick is just a brick, basically. Like occasionally you find a really nice, beautiful brick, but most of them are just bricks. But they all have to go into our wall and into our foundation to make a house that's going to be nice and strong and have a broad base, and then can grow up and we can add all the stories to it in our analogy, right? The higher the house or the building we're building, the higher the peak fitness. But the bigger the base, the more stable the structure will be and the more durability it will have in times of inclement weather. So like these days are just bricks. So we have to just focus on getting the work done. Just go out and do your efforts and do the best you can. And if you find yourself having that monkey mind dialogue about how your power isn't enough on a given day, then you have to take a step back and ask the question, am I getting the work done within the range that we're looking for? Am I working hard, which presumably on an interval day, a maximum effort day is the objective? And am I able to basically meet the parameters of the workout? I'm not completely nosediving, right? I'm not well below the effort. I'm not we don't want people to be giving themselves like a root canal with no Novocaine. Like pain and struggle are part of endurance sports and they're part of doing intervals. However, there's a point when it's like, let's be sensible, right? So if you have deep muscle fatigue, I coach athletes, when you hit that point, like, you know it. Don't second guess it. When you start asking these questions, that's a day to just leave the intervals behind, go home and send me a message and we'll discuss it, right? We can talk about how to adjust the schedule and what's going on in your life. So I really encourage people to not be a slave to the numbers, not be dogmatic about getting a certain amount of work done, and also to be gentle with yourself, to not be so self-judging. That negative voice that we all have, that self-critic, that voice that tells you you're not fast enough, you shouldn't be doing this, you're not strong enough, you're not tough enough, etc. All those negative little voices from the devil on your shoulder that tell you that you suck, those training is to a certain degree about learning to quiet that voice. And the power meter can be a vehicle for magnifying that voice. And that's not constructive as an athlete. The point of athletics is to rise up and express your highest potential. It's not to be flogging yourself all the time or beating yourself up in your own mental world. So this is some of the framework that I use when I offer coaching with my athletes around power meters and how to have a good relationship with it. Hopefully that's helpful.
You know, that framework you just described, I think is so productive. And the way I mentioned earlier in the podcast that I've really come full circle with my perspective on training with power, to the point where every ride is fun at this point, right? Like whether it's raining or I'm doing good watts or not doing good watts, it's all fun. And that's a perspective shift, because, you know, it's just another brick in the wall, right? And the more bricks we have, the higher the wall we will stack. So let's collect bricks. And that's it at the end of the day. And so what I found is that by kind of making the transition from, because I used to beat myself up. I'm sure we all did at some point. Nicki, you talked about, you know, the hardship you went through. Like, that's just, cycling's not as fun, right? And like, it can be this tool that helps you progress as a human being every single day and gain thought clarity and hit that accountability checkpoint on your checklist, and, you know, really be a high level individual. But at the same time, like, when you go out there and you have a bad day, all of the positivity that you gain from going out and getting a session kind of goes down the drain when you fall into this negative attitude of beating yourself up. And it's amazing how many people out there in the world suffer from that. And if I could just, you know, with this podcast, if we could convince one person, just one listener, to have fun and let go of that self-criticism and understand that, you know, there's tons of bricks to be collected on bad days, then I think the podcast would be a huge success. But what about you, Nicki? How are you using power in your coaching practice today?
It's a big question, and it is an integral part of the way that I coach, and also, like both you, Colby and Zack, talked about, the initial talk I have when I start with a new rider, to coach a new rider, is that I say, I don't want to focus too much on you beating records. So you won't see me just being overly excited every time you do super numbers, because I don't want you to come into the same problem that I had with the power meter actually becoming your enemy. It became my enemy, so I don't want that. It's a little bit difficult for me to actually stick to that myself, because I get super happy when I see athletes that I coach breaking records, and I do tell them, but I try to not focus too much on breaking records. But at the same time, I tell them I want the power meter to help you to have an extra tool, a weapon when you are doing races or you are doing group rides and you want to beat the competition. and that is the precision that you learn in training. I don't want you to look at it in a race. It's too dangerous. But to have that precision in training so that you know exactly how close to the limit you can go. There, the power meter is a super tool, because let's face it, a lot of the riders that we coach are relatively new in cycling, and they don't have the same feeling of pacing as you do, Zach, or you do, Colby, or as I do. They are more all over the pacing, and it goes fast one moment, and it loses you lose the power, you lose the speed, you lose the momentum at another point. So I want them to learn that trait like we have, and at the same time, it's also a very good way of being precise in your power, in your energy usage, in the way that, for example, we talked a little bit about cadence, and we do a lot of workouts based on cadence. We do torque work, big gears, low RPM, and we do high cadence trainings with high RPM. And when we look at the heart rate, for example, in an interval with higher RPM, let's say tempo workout, which is the zone below threshold, and the rider is doing that as some of the workouts you've done at 110 RPM, you see that the heart rate goes higher and higher and higher, and the heart rate goes into your threshold zone in that tempo workout, which is fantastic for training, but it's also a tool to use in a race. So if you want to be as effective as possible in a race, you don't want to do 110 RPM, because it's gonna make you ineffective. So that's another tool, but and we could talk for hours and hours about the uses of power meter there, but basically I want the riders to use the power meter in a way, both for of course for analysis, but also in a way of, I want it to be a weapon for them in a race situation or in a training situation.
Interesting. I think it's a great tool to teach people what feelings represent. Right? It teaches you intuition. Without that display on your screen, it can be a little bit tough to understand what feelings represent in terms of output. So it's pretty good. But if it seems like we're talking a lot about setting PRs and stuff, so it's actually a perfect segue into this next thing I want to chat about. But if I were to take a step back for a second here and look at the high performance community as a whole, and when I say high performance community, I'm referring to anyone who is actively pursuing growth through sport, and obviously in this case, cycling. I'd say that one of the top contributing factors to developmental restriction is mindset and general perspective around challenge and the unique challenges that exist within each training session or interval for that matter. In the circumstance that an athlete is doing intervals and they see subpar numbers displayed on their head unit, it's so easy to go down the mental pathway of self-destruction instead of embracing the challenge and turning a tough moment into a moment of progress and growth. Colby, in the past, you've shared with me such a beautiful reference in the story of the high jumper pursuing progress and how it's important to understand that progress is not linear. I was hoping you could share that here.
Yeah, so the high jumper story is relevant because cycling is a sport that's undergone transition. So we can think of all sports in two broad categories. We can think of sports that are subjective and we don't have a definite way to quantify their output. An example of this would be figure skating or gymnastics, the floor exercises. There are certain parameters that each athlete must compete in those events, but ultimately the success of those athletes are judged by a panel of judges. And yeah, when a figure skater does their first triple axel, you can say it's better than when they could only do a double axel or whatever before, but there's no way to quantitatively say if he or she does 1,000 triple axels, which one is the best triple axel they've ever done. That's a subjective judgment versus sports that are inherently objective. Track running, for example, 10,000 meter or 50 meter sprint, right? These types of events, one person crosses the line in front of the other and you know their time to the thousandth of a second. Pursuit on the track, kilo on the track, other examples, timed events that are very crisp. Scratch race on the track. Somebody wins a scratch race to the first one across the line, period.
So
Cycling has gone from one category to the other, not in the scratch race example and not in track cycling, but in road cycling it has. Because when I grew up racing with JV, we had no power meters, of course. We would just go up a hill, a local climb, and we would feel how fast we went up that climb. Maybe we could time ourselves from the bottom to the top, but that was all impacted by physics. And so we didn't really understand if we were getting better. And better was very subjective. We could trend our fitness through things like race results, but even race results, the results of many races are confounded by different variables such as flat tires or wind or terrain or weather, for example. When I was young, I was really good at racing in cold weather and I sucked in hot weather. I was terrible in hot weather races. So if you put me in the heat, I would wilt and not really express my fitness. If you put me in a snowstorm, suddenly I was Superman and I was maybe better than some of my other competitors. So that's just the way I was built as a young rider. Then as I evolved and matured as a racer, those things equalized and then they started to actually flip a little bit. But that was just my evolution and my path as a cyclist. But those are things you couldn't weigh or measure. They were outcomes that were more subjective. So a power meter came along and it allowed us to objectify the sport. And that invention isn't that new, right? Power meters were first invented right around the year 2000s when they became commercially available for most people. You know, the SRM started to come around in the late 90s. And then Power Tap and some other devices came along. And so even though it's been around for 24 years, there are a lot of cyclists who don't really understand the normal progression of athletic progress or the normal curve of athletic progress, the normal growth. They think that it's linear, meaning you get better bit by bit endlessly. So this is where the high jump example comes in. So let's imagine you're a high jumper at the world level and you've attended world championships for a few years and you are progressing towards the Olympic cycle, the 4-year cycle. And so you train for 3 or 4 years and you're on the national team and you're attending world championships and you get 12th and then you get 8th and then you get 5th at worlds. And then it's the Olympic year and you train super hard and you win the bronze medal. And your high jump is whatever height. I don't know. I don't actually know what the world record is for high jump right now. So it's a bad example from that perspective, but just imagine as a thought experiment, it's here. And you jump that to win the bronze medal and it's the best jump you've ever done. Okay, cool. So then like every Olympian does, you go on a 1-month break, you go on vacation with your spouse or your partner, or maybe by yourself or your friends, and you relax and you forget about your sport and you celebrate the fact that you won a bronze medal. Maybe you're bummed out that you didn't win gold, but in any case, you've got this experience of processing the Olympics and you step away from your sport and you consider and you digest. You alchemize your experience and then you decide, am I going to go for another 4 years? And since you won the bronze in this thought experiment, we're going to decide that you say, I'm going to go one more round. I'm going to do this for another 4 years. I'm going to try to win the gold. I know I can do it. And so now we are 11 months and 3 years from your next Olympic Games.
Yes, sir.
And after your 1-month break where you laid on the beach and drank margaritas and had fun and enjoyed life like kind of a normal person. And you go back to training and you say, okay, now I've taken my 4-week break and I'm going to go start training again. Here's my question. On that first day of training, 3 years and 11 months from your next Olympic Games, do you put the bar 1/8 of an inch higher than it was when you won your bronze medal at the Olympics? Of course not. As soon as I explain this to people, they immediately intuitively see, even someone who's not really of a coaching mindset, that wouldn't make sense. Because if the logic was that then you were going to train 5 times a week for the next 3 years and 11 months, and you raise the bar, maybe not even every session, but every week, 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters or whatever you want to call it, some tiny amount, by the time you train for that period of time, you would have usurped the world record by several feet, right? But that's the way we imagine athletic progress. We imagine it as this linear step where you go out and you add a little bit more every time you train. And there's nothing, this is a straight line that we made in our minds. And if you think about that for a second, there are no straight lines in nature. So this doesn't really make sense. Straight lines are man-made things. We're the ones who made buildings and walls and right angles. Trees more or less grow in straight lines, but horizons aren't straight. Sunsets aren't straight. Waves aren't straight, right? So you see my point. Leaves aren't straight. There's nothing straight in nature, really. So even force occurs in waves or fields or spirals. And so we consider this relationship, this idea that we have in our mind, and we apply it to power. And when you apply it to power, what you do is you say to yourself, well, the best I ever did for this duration was this many watts. So we'll take the ubiquitous 20-minute power. You say, I made 300 watts, last June or a month ago or last week. And then you go up another 20-minute long climb. And now, unless you make 301 watts, the ride is deemed as a failure. And this is the equivalent of applying the 3 millimeter higher bar every week to your high jump. And for some reason in high jump, we see quickly, I think it's intuitive. It's easy to intuit that doesn't make sense. But in cycling, for some reason, we don't see it that way. We expect that we're going to set a personal record every day that we do a maximal effort. And this is not how training works. This is not how bodies works. It's not how physiology works. It's not how humans work. So most of the days when we go out and we do a maximal effort over any duration, it doesn't matter if we're talking about a 10-second sprint or a 20-minute effort or a 5-minute effort or a 3-hour ride. Most of the days we do that, we don't set personal records, nor should we expect to. Now, there's a caveat here. So if you're really new to the sport, you're going to set more of those PRs, especially if you have a strong athletic background in an endurance sport and you're transitioning to cycling and you've just begun to weigh and measure your cycling, we'll say, or quantify your cycling, right? Then you're going to set more PRs more often because your progress is earlier in the curve. But one of the most fundamental rules of sport is the rate of diminishing returns. So as you mature as an athlete, the rule of diminishing returns state that you have to put more and more effort in to get smaller and smaller gains, right? That's why elite athletes train so much. And so everyone is subject to this rule to some degree. And the further you go in the sport, the more effort you will have to put in, and the less gain you will get from that effort. It's just a rule of sports, because you're optimizing your own performance and therefore approaching your own edge of potential, your horizon of potential. Now, that horizon can get moved at times, right? But we don't expect to make linear progress towards that horizon of potential that any athlete has. This is unrealistic thinking. It's a model that we have in our heads that we're trying to apply to the physical universe. And in my experience, whenever we make up things in our head, nice stories in our head, and we try to apply them to the physical world too often, we end up being disappointed or suffering. And this is the ultimate unfortunate consequence of working with a power meter, is that riders sometimes become disenchanted with the sport. They believe that they're failing if they don't set a PR every time they go out and do an effort of similar duration. And this just isn't the way it works. This is not the way sport works.
No, just also like I totally agree, and a good advice from my first coach, Bjarne Riis, again, is like the prescribed training is based on everything being optimal for that day. And how often is that? And when we mean optimal, is like no high humidity, no high temperature, good sleep at night, no fight with the wife, anything, not being held up in traffic or anything like that, no injuries, no sickness, all these things. And when you ask yourself the question, how often is that the case? that that everything is optimal. It's actually not very often, at least not when you're really pushing yourself in training. When you are doing a hard training program, often you have things going against you, and it's up to the rider, him or herself, to be sure to adjust the training based on that day. So if it is 33 degrees, I just spoke to a new rider that I coach, Daniel, that lives in Singapore. And if it is 33 degrees and a humidity of 80%, well, you have to know that you have to do less power in these intervals. It's not possible to do the same output. So everything, the training is prescribed for when everything is optimal. That's basically just what I wanted to add.
That's a great point. And I think you guys both really clearly illustrated how important it is to understand really how hard you should be pushing yourself, and that there is hard, and then there's too hard. And one of the tools that I'll share with you, the listeners, that I use in my coaching practice, something that I always teach my athletes, is when things get hard, and they will get hard, I'm talking about the moments where you want to quit, instead of focusing on how hard or how difficult it is, understand that the feeling you are experiencing in the moment is the exact reason that you're doing it, and that these moments of chaos are the moments of progress. And the feeling that pushes you forward, I found, is a simple shift in your mindset, and just understanding that these even subpar performances will move you forward. And like Colby said, every 389 watt brick is just as important as every 400 watt brick. So just a little shift in the mindset there can make a big difference. And you've probably established by now that there is no silver bullet in cycling development. And in order to perform well in the sport, you need to develop a well-rounded depth of abilities that support each other. Nicki, at this stage in your career, you are truly one of the only people on the planet that has gone through the entire life cycle of a cyclist, in the sense that you were an aspiring pro, then a neo-pro, where you struggled in the peloton. Then you became a great pro, reaching a level where you could win races and stages in races like the Tour de France. Then you became a director, where you helped other pros win races from the team car. And now you're a cycling coach. Where do you stand today with your perspective on power and its place in the development of riders?
It's definitely a thing that is very important, especially in the first part of the development of a rider, and surely also later on. But as we talked about, when you get more accustomed and to knowing yourself a lot better, you can start the next level is starting to maybe detach yourself a little bit from the power meter. But it's a wonderful tool to use, and I love in our EF coaching program, I love the power zones that we didn't talk about so much yet. We have a 8-zone power zone. How's the word for it? Yeah, 8 levels in the power zones, and it's a fantastic tool to use. And back also to some of the points earlier on with riders not being super happy about the training, we can see as the coach very quickly, well, you are in the zone as we prescribed, because these zones expand of around in often in cases of 150 watts or so. And as long as they are in those zones, they are doing good in training. So it's a fantastic tool. I love using it, and it's a fantastic way of having this special connection with the riders that we all love so much. You know, we can really track the training of the riders, and we have a lot to discuss with the riders when we now I lost the word in English, when we analyze the training. Right?
Colby, you always talk about how your track experience had such a big impact on your overall development of a rider. And on one of our previous coaching calls, where for the listeners, we have coaching calls every 2 weeks where all of our coaches from all over the world, get together and we talk about a lot of our coached athletes issues and different obstacles we're overcoming. And of course we have, exercise physiologists on the team where we're discussing new training concepts, so on and so forth. And one of the great points that Colby shared was how the track really taught you how to go hard and how to actually push yourself. And I was hoping that you could maybe share a little bit of perspective on how, that kind of came to fruition, what the process was like in learning how to really go hard, and then how the power meter kind of, fits into that recipe.
Yeah. So I had the good fortune to grow up racing track in Colorado. When I was a young rider, I fell in love with this sport. I felt like I got struck by lightning. So I had a road bike at that point. And then I went out and got myself a track bike and a mountain bike and also a cyclocross bike. And I learned a lot about myself having that experience. One of the things I learned is that I was terrible at cyclocross, like atrociously terrible. So that was my weakest discipline by far. I wasn't a great mountain biker. I had some sort of talent for track, I suppose, but all my talents are more classified as determination rather than raw ability. So in any case, I started racing track, and track is largely divided into two worlds. It's divided into the sprint world and the endurance world. And track sprinters are athletes who are generally a lot more muscular than the endurance riders. We're talking north of 160 pounds. I think that's like 70-ish kilos. My math might be a little fuzzy there. 75-ish kilos, but probably more north of that, up to, we'll say, close to 100 kilos. I mean, there are track riders who are sprinters who weigh around 200 pounds, over 200 pounds for sure. So these are big guys, big gals, right? And the endurance side of the sport ends up being more looking like not quite a typical roadie, still a little more muscular, more like a criterium rider, right? And track is naturally sifted into different events, different timed events. And some of those are considered sprint events and some are considered endurance events. But what's interesting about track is that when these events were created, since the inception of these events, they naturally gravitated towards physiological energy systems. And they didn't do this by design. They did it because people realized that physiologically, these durations were interesting to watch. They were separators. They were natural sifters of ability, right? So what do I mean by that? Well, we go out on the road and we do a sprint. How long can you maximally sprint for? Maybe 10, 12, maybe 15 seconds before you start to have to change energy systems from what we'll call the neurological system into the glycolytic system, right? And then you can run on the glycolytic energy system and you'll exhaust that in about 45 seconds, maybe 60 seconds. It depends on the athlete exactly. But eventually that system will start to become fatigued. And then you've got to downshift into the aerobic system. So as we progressively downshift from neurological to glycolytic to aerobic, we have this change in characteristics. And the changes are that we go from making more power explosively, even more explosively, but we have shorter duration and longer recovery. And then in the glycolytic system, we have, less power than sprint, but more than aerobic. And we have this situation that's sort of medium recovery, right? And then we have aerobic power, which makes the least amount of raw energy, right? But it's a sustainable form of energy. It can last for a much longer duration, and it needs a shorter recovery period, even when it becomes exhausted. And those natural barriers of around 10, 12 seconds, around 45 to 60 seconds, and around 5 minutes of maximal aerobic capacity, or VO2 max, we might call it, those are events on the track. The 200-meter time trial takes about 10 seconds for a lot of riders, 10 to 12. The 1 kilometer time trial takes around a minute or a minute and change. And the pursuit takes around 4 to 5 minutes, depending on the rider and the track. So these are natural distances that were sort of arrived at because of the the physiology of a rider and how it expresses. So when people started racing each other and we saw different types of riders who could express different types of energy systems or proficiency at using those energy systems, we discovered that those systems sort of kind of petered out at a certain duration. And then it was like, well, hey, let's make an event out of this. This will be fun to watch. We'll see who can hang on the longest. And so track really taught me to understand those energy systems experientially, right? I went out and did 200-meter time trials, and I really learned the difference between that type of effort and a glycolytic effort, a 1 kilometer effort that took me, I think the first kilo I ever did took me 1 minute and 12 seconds. And that was like a new experience. I mean, compared to road, there's something about track that just brings up the intensity a whole other level. It's really something to experience. And track can be a really powerful teacher in that sense. And the same with the pursuit. You know, I thought I was going hard in a 20-minute time trial or up a canyon, a local climb that maybe took me 20 or 30 minutes. And then I went and did a pursuit, and I realized what it meant to really, really dig. I mean, with 3 laps to go, you're wondering if you're going to make it to the line at about this pace or if you're going to pass out. That kind of effort. It's a different world of intensity. So track illustrates those energy systems very clearly, and it also gives you the experience of learning about those energy systems firsthand as you get to ride in those systems and express, we'll say, go as fast as you can over those distances.
No, yeah, I totally agree. And a good example, I think, is a rider that you coach, Colby. It's Craig that lives in Toronto. I rode with Craig in Lombardy. We did the Grand Fondo in Lombardy with the Team EF coaching, and he did good. And then he came and we did the Grand Fondo in Tour of Flanders together. And after that, actually, Roubaix, he stayed for Roubaix camp as well. Zack was there. And he had started doing track racing in that period. And his development as a rider was amazing. Like, it was his technique in cornering was, he was, I'm not the best cornering guy out there, but I have had a lot of experience, and I'm not too bad at it. He was just as good as me or better. He was not as good as Zack, but he was good. And yeah, his confidence on the bike and the surplus he had within his limitations was fantastic. So I totally agree, man. The number one for me is, if you had to add in something really special, would be to add track training or track racing, not only because of the ability to work on specific power ranges, as you say, but also the technical part of it. It's a huge tool, and I'm pushing it with a few of the riders that I'm coaching right now.
So, Nicki, I won't let you get away with that one. You've definitely done more high-speed cornering than any of us. I think 1,100 pro race days.
Yeah.
But I think for me, if I think about just track training and its real developmental benefits are defining moment situations in repetition, right? So if you do a road race or you do a Grand Fondo, you have to ride like 2 or 3 hours to the point where you are in the race winning mode. You're super competitive. On the track, you do this over and over and over again, sometimes 3-4 events in a day, or, you know, sets of 4 or 5 different intervals. And you really get to learn how to push yourself independently, but then also in group scenarios. And speaking of Craig specifically, that was one of the big things I noticed, was how comfortable he was in that group scenario at the different races. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Nicki. That was that's a really, really good point. Thanks for sharing that, both of you guys.
I just did a Grand Fondo last Sunday with Eric that I coach, and he wanted to qualify for Worlds. And Eric is 61 years old and has no race experience. He's an ex-rower, but he's strong and he's very committed to his training. And he came and did this race, Grand Fondo, together with me. I was helping him to see if he could qualify for Worlds, and he started off well, and then we went into the technical roads, left and right, and there was some crosswind, and he could not hold the position like all the other guys in that race. Most of the other guys, he missed qualification by 9 seconds. He did a great race, but he just missed qualification. But the point is that we talked about afterwards, most of these guys that he was racing against has maybe 30 years of experience of racing. They've had numbers on their back already 30, 40 years ago or more. And it would be unfair if he would come in with so little racing experience and be just as good as them in the technical aspects. So I told him, and I truly believe this, if you would have the chance to train on the track for a few times, maybe once a week or twice every 2 weeks, he would go from being his weak point to actually being his strong point in racing. I think it goes that fast when you do track training. Maybe I'm mistaken, but I truly believe this.
Yeah, from my perspective, it's really about mastering different aspects of performance and knowing yourself as an athlete, right? Having that internal knowledge. And for me, there are 3 big categories of athletic performance that we can kind of lump into piles. One would be the engine, and we're talking about all aspects of the engine, not just the aerobic engine or the giant FTP engine, but also the glycolytic engine and the neurological engine, we'll say, right? And then we expand those parameters of those engines, not just the peak of those, not just the best performances, but the durability of those engines over time, right? So, example, a lot of people will go out and do a typical classic FTP test, and they'll warm up for 30 minutes, and then they'll go smash 20 minutes, and then they'll take 95% of that and call that their FTP. And there's nothing wrong with this technique. It's a model. What we're trying to do is create a repeatable test protocol in the real world that people can use to set up their zones. And that is repeatable, but is it applicable to most real world conditions? Well, okay, good question. So we have to ask ourselves, how many times in a race do you produce 20 minutes of straight power, maximal? Well, never in a criterium, never in most road races, unless you have a climb that happens to be 20 to 30 minutes long. We'll fudge the duration a little bit. But let's put a pin in that because there's a few points to make there, which you're probably already thinking of. And even in a hill climb, we wouldn't do that because normally, unless it's the world's steepest hill climb, like Mount Washington maybe or something, there's some game playing in a hill climb, right? There's some accelerations, some attacks, and some irregularity to pace. People don't just go to the front and hammer even in a hill climb, typically. What other types of races do we have? Well, we have got gravel. Yeah. Even in gravel races, there aren't that many 20-minute extended periods of maximal effort because a gravel race, could be anywhere from 2 to 7, 9 hours. So very rarely would you open the engine to the same level that you would in a 20-minute maximal effort where you finish completely drained, right? You're never going to quite open the throttle to that degree in a gravel race, most likely, because you've got another 4 hours of riding left or 6 hours of riding left. So it's not directly applicable, but okay, let's take that aside for a moment and just ask the question, is it still applicable as a standardized means to gain an understanding of what your power zones are or what your functional threshold power is, and then you can base your subsequent zones and training off that effort. That's the concept. So I think we would agree, unless you're talking about a flat 20 or 25-minute time trial, there aren't many applications, or a solo hill climb time trial, there aren't many applications of real world racing or testing where this would be that useful. But let's look at our zone. So what are we doing? We're giving the rider an optimal warm up. Presumably they've had a rest day the day before. We're giving them an optimal warm up. So they go into this test day optimally hydrated and fueled. Okay, cool. And not neurologically fatigued, right? And so they go then into their local road race, the example I gave. And let's say there's a 20-minute hill in that race, or let's say there are 3 30-minute climbs. Well, okay, if the first climb is in the first hour, then it's probably going to reflect more or less what the rider could do on a test day. But then the second climb is going to be an hour later, we'll say, and that's less applicable because now you've already got an hour and a half, 2 hours worth of work in it in the system with a maximal effort. So you're fatigued. So we would anticipate that the rider would perform at not the same level. And then by the time they get to the third climb, of course, they're producing less power, unless they're a really well-trained athlete and their durability is exceptionally high. Of course, those athletes exist, but most athletes will experience some level of fatigue during this type of race. So what are the relevant zones? Do we say that do we hold this first 20-minute effort in high esteem and we call that the perfect expression of fitness and everything else is just you're failing after that? I don't think that's really the way to think about it, but I think that's commonly what's accepted. Instead, I prefer the more descriptive reality that functional threshold power is not a fixed point in time. It's something that changes over the daily experience or even the hourly experience of an athlete within an event or within a week. So another example, let's say somebody trains really hard for 3 days in a row. They do a 3-day block. And then on the fourth day, they wake up and they are super fatigued, right? They've got soreness walking down the stairs to go make their coffee in the morning. Legs are loaded. Resting heart rate is high. They feel tired. They feel like they should sleep a little more. They've got some fatigue in their lungs even when they climb the stairs, this kind of thing. We've all experienced this at the end of a couple hard days of riding. But we're going to be cruel coaches and we're going to tell them they have to go out and do a functional threshold power test on that fourth day. And they go out and they listen to us because they're good, obedient athletes, and they go do it and they finish 15% lower than their best FTP. Okay, so how do we view that number? Is it just a number we disregard because they say, oh, they were tired, so it doesn't count? Maybe, but what if it was the fourth day of the Tour de France? What if it was the fourth day of a stage race? What if they were doing Haute Route or a gravel stage race or Rebecca's Private Idaho and it was the third day of a gravel event and they woke up with that same level of fatigue? Do we say the day just doesn't count? Well, they pinned a number on and they're racing that day, so it does count. So I would offer that functional threshold power is something we've idealized into this concept that is, it's really something we strive for and we model as perfection, but it's not actually that often that we can achieve that level, especially if we go out on a day where everything comes together and we have one of our better days that we've had in months and we make this sort of unicorn power, as I call it, right? So let's say your normal 20 or 25 minute power is whatever, we'll say 300 watts. And one day you go out and you uncork a 339. And then of course you're going to round up to 340 because that sounds even cooler, right? It's funny how when something costs $99.99, we think of it as, about $90. But power, if it's 338 watts, well, it was definitely a 340, right? We round up or down selectively depending on what we're trying to do. If we're trying to justify the cost of a new barbecue, it's less. If we trying to tell someone how much our power is, it's always more, right? The fish was almost 6 feet long. So, okay, that's fine. That's human nature. But is it useful to use those numbers as your model? I would argue not, because if 99 out of 100 times you make 300 watts, and then one day you have this unicorn day where you make 339, and you base your zones off of that number, the rest of the year, effectively, you're going to be training a little bit too hard all the time. And there's probably a side of you who's like, oh, that sounds like a great idea. If I train a little bit too hard all the time, I'll probably be Tade in no time. That's not how this works. Training is about appropriate dose at the right moment. And that's it, right? It's just enough load to make you respond and get you a little stronger. But remember, you don't get stronger when you're adding more load. You get stronger when you rest. So there's a two-part process to this. You add load and then you deload to allow the athlete to recover and get stronger. If you just add load all the time, which is what you would be doing if your zones were set a little bit optimistically, a little bit too high, If you just continually add load at all moments, then the athlete just gets pummeled and they're tired and they don't express their fitness. So that's another way to say what's happening to our athlete in our thought experiment on the 4th day. If we make them get up and do a 20-minute field test and they're 10% or 15% lower than their best, or even their best average, or their average best 20-minute, we'll say it that way, which is the best way to set your zones or your intensity spectrum. If they're 10 or 15% lower, then we might say, well, you are definitely fit, but right now you're not expressing it to the previous level you have because of your fatigue. So this is an essential component to understanding how power works. Power allows us to objectively measure our output in training, right? Kilojoules, average power, normalized power, all these neat little numbers. But it also helps us understand when we're fooling ourselves and we're actually quite fatigued and it's time for rest. And that's when the power meter can objectively be quite useful. You go out and you try, and you just can't make the power. It's not there, and the power meter won't lie to you then, right? It won't tell you, oh, you're doing good enough, you should keep going. It's like, you should go home and take a nap. And there are days in every athlete's season when they go riding and they should really go home and take a nap. So the power meter can help answer that question. Of course, it's good to have conversations with your coach about days where you went home and took a nap, or maybe even send them a message and say, I'm not feeling it today. I think my best efforts are going to be in a day or two when I've had a little chance to recover and absorb the last training block. So that was a bit all over the place, but hopefully these are the ways, hopefully these are helpful ways that you can think about how to relate to power in a constructive manner so that you can advance your training without, we'll say, running yourself into the ground or being too focused on objective results to the point where it really makes you miserable in the sport or not appreciate the progress you are making.
But I think you bring up a really valuable point there, and it kind of comes full circle on the origin of this podcast, and it's understanding how to use the power meter as a tool in training. And I think that, to your point, Eric, Olympic level rowing coach, phenomenal athlete, really strong guy, tons of talent on the physiology side. No matter how big the engine is, if you don't know how to apply it to the sport, whether it's through strategy or through knowing where to apply it in a particular part of a course, up a hill, through a corner, down a hill, so on and so forth, right? Then a lot of power goes to waste. And we actually can't maximize our physiological capabilities. So all the time we spent, really staring at our power meter, trying to get 1 or 2 more watts or 5 more watts on a particular interval is all wasted time, because we could have maybe done a few less watts and learned how to ride terrain as fast as possible and maybe got more overall development, back to Colby's reference onto how complicated development in physiology can be, because we're growing in many shapes and in many directions all at one time. And really applying that power is such a critical part to the sport. We can all think of countless pros who were so genetically gifted, but maybe didn't have the best technical abilities and lost races to people with smaller engines. We still see it today. It happens every day in pro cycling, right? So that's something really important to consider for all of our listeners here. I think at the end of the day is, intervals are designed to help you increase your fitness and also teach you different sensations that you feel in races and all sorts of great things. But at the end of the day, we have to be great bike riders if we want to win in competitive scenarios. And the training just supports you to make good decisions and to apply yourself to your full potential in competitive scenarios, whether you want to win Grand Fondo World Championships like a lot of Nicki's athletes, or I think, Colby, you did you not win a UCI Grand Fondo Championship with one of your athletes last year? Yes. Right. Yep. So whether you want to take it to that level or you want to, win your local group ride or not get dropped anymore, understanding that how you apply all of this hard work you put in is critical.
So one of the more interesting and useful lessons that I had when I began to use power for the first time was the relationship between perceived exertion and actual output. This is the essence of pacing, right? And so before I had a power meter, I would go up a climb, or I would do a time trial on the flats. And my effort felt, from a perceived exertion standpoint, that is my own internal tachometer of how hard I was going, it felt like this. And then at the end, it would go like that to the line. It would kind of sprint to the line, right? So it felt very flat, like a giant dinner plate. And then it would go up, right? And that's not, as it turns out, what I was actually doing. When I had power, which was an objective sense of output, right? And I compared that to my sense of perceived exertion, I realized that those two actually weren't the same. There was quite a difference there. And so so the first thing you do is you ride a time trial with your power meter and you're watching the numbers and you're going, well, that's weird. That doesn't match what I'm experiencing. I'm experiencing a flat line and then a lift in the last 30 seconds to sprint to the line, or maybe the last minute, depending on the time trial. I'm assuming there's a relatively flat time trial in our example. So now we look at the power as we're doing this flat time trial. And what we see is we start off up here, and in the first 5 minutes, it starts to go down, 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 and then it sort of flattens out. And then at the end, it might lift up. So we get a very U-shaped curve, right? And then you have to ask the question, well, how big was the dip in the middle of that U? If it was really deep, if there was a big U shape to it, it suggests that my pacing wasn't optimal. Even though my perceived exertion felt the same, what I was doing is I was overloading myself with effort, and then I was carrying the load of that effort through the middle of the time trial. And this is how physiology works. You can hit yourself with a big wave of load, a big wave of cardiovascular load, and a large wave of lactate, we'll say, and you can carry that wave. You can sort of battle that wave for a long time, or you can be a little clever and you can bring on the load very carefully, in a very measured sense. And you can slowly lift your pace and then lift it to maximum throttle and hold, and then try to lift at the end if there's anything left. And if the lift is too sharp at the end, then we know your baseline effort ideally wasn't high enough. Now, this is a pacing strategy that may work often for a lot of riders. For some riders, it may not be the best pacing strategy. You would have to go find out for yourself and do a bunch of time trials and look at your time against your output and your perceived exertion, and you'd start to figure it out. So that's all part of the training process. But what power can do is at least shed light on the delta between your perceived exertion and what your actual output is, and the relationship of those two curves and how they change. And once you start to see that, you begin to have a depth of understanding of yourself. And that's really what using a power meter is about, is having an insight into your own physiology, your own abilities, what you're doing well, and maybe what you're not quite optimizing. And then measuring that against the demands of the race, the demands of the course, the hills, the downhills, the flats, the wind, the headwind, tailwind, the side wind. All of these types of real world conditions are what change the parameters of how you make power. Because of course they change the resistance you face, right? Whether it's more torque oriented or more cadence oriented, because these are the two components that make up power. And as those two variables change, it tends to either magnify a rider's strengths or highlight their weaknesses. Generally speaking, riders are a little better at one than they are at the other. Not always, but often that's the case. And so you have to know yourself. You have to know what your strategy is. Is it more torque-based or more cadence-based? Are you more strength-based, or are you more oriented towards utilizing your VO2 max? So, just ideas.
That's such a good point. You know, this past Saturday, I was riding with one of Tade's teammates, and we're talking about the opposite end of the spectrum, where, you know, there's this sprinter Alvaro Hodge, and I think in my opinion, Alvaro, watt for watt, is the most powerful sprinter I have ever come across in my life. We're talking about a guy that, like, head to head, absolutely crushed guys like Tim Merlier, right? Just a couple of years ago. And so, like, I'm a pretty explosive guy, and Alvaro can ride me off his wheel. It's something I've never experienced in my life until this past Saturday. And so, on a flat road. Well, obviously I've been dropped plenty of times on the hills, but here's somebody who I think, in races, he's hitting between 1,800 and 2,000 watts, right? At the end of a long race, which is insane, right? It is crazy, but he's not winning. And the reason he's not winning is because of his timing and his approach and how he's navigating those finals. So same team, same scenario, biggest engine, not winning. And I think that's really important for people to understand, right? Is just to extend on Colby's point and just to make that example kind of come full circle. Tadej wins, he's got the biggest engine, that's great, but there's other people with the most power and the most strength, and they're not winning, even in the same team, right? So it's really a matter of mastering yourself and working with what you're working with.
I think we just have a topic for another podcast. The technical abilities, the tactical abilities, and certainly also the mindset that you need to have in order to do exceptional when you're in a race situation.
So yeah, I think the big picture message that we're having here, or the discussion, is that people focus so much on the engine aspect of the performance of the athlete, right? They really want to emphasize the engine above all things. But the reality is that engine plays an outcome, of course, in race performance, right? In particular, the aerobic engine, it's the most important component, single component. However, if we train the aerobic engine at the neglect of all other aspects of cycling skills or abilities, then of course we're showing up to a chess match with only one piece. And it's a big piece. It's a really important piece. Maybe it's the queen, but without the other players, you're never going to win the game. Like never. And also, I won't say never, because of course we have an outstanding example of that right now in modern sport. That's Tadej. He's got this huge engine and he's just slaughtering everybody based on that engine alone. But it's so easy for people to ignore the fact that, yeah, when he rides an 80-kilometer solo in Strada, he can't crash on all those fast downhill, waterboardy, sandy, slippery, unpredictable corners, right? If he can't handle his bike at the level that his power is, or at the speed that his power is giving him, then he's not gonna win, right? He's gonna dump it. But he didn't crash. He made it to the line. And there's 100 other skills that Tadej has to have that aren't as obvious, especially to the untrained eye. What we see is, ooh, wow, fireworks, power. And so then we assume that we should go out and set a PR in every single ride, and then in 3 years we'll be as good as Tadej is. And I think that's the risk of training, a training program that is dictated by power alone. It makes the assumption that, or it leads the rider and perhaps even the coach to believe that this is the only factor or the only parameter in cycling performance that matters. And the reality is that cycling is a sport that requires lots of different aspects to draw together a race win. Lots of different parameters that go into an athlete really performing at the highest level, or even maximizing their potential, whatever level that is, right?
Let us know in the comments if you want that podcast. So I think that's a wrap on this episode. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Team EF Coaching Cycling Performance Podcast. We appreciate you spending this time with us, and we hope that you have gained some knowledge and insights that will help make you not only a better cyclist, but also help you enjoy your cycling more. Until next time, ride safe, everyone.